March 8, 1943, Mount Seraphina, Valdorian Peninsula. The observation logs from the UNS Artemisia would later be classified for decades, recording a site that defied every principle of conventional warfare the Allied Naval Command had learned. In 4 hours, positions that had withstood months of bombardment simply vanished, not to artillery shells that missed their mark, not to bombs that bounced off reinforced concrete, but to liquid fire that flowed like molten death through tunnels thought impregnable, turning underground fortresses into crematoriums from which no screams escaped. The morning mist clung to the granite slopes as Commander Elena Vasquez peered through her binoculars from the ship's observation deck. What she witnessed would haunt her for the rest of her life. Cave openings that had blazed with muzzle flashes moments before suddenly erupted in orange torrents, followed by an eerie silence that seemed to swallow the mountain whole. In her official report, later discovered in declassified naval archives, Vasquez wrote words that would have earned her a court-martial for their brutal honesty. "We didn't capture those positions. We incinerated the women defending them." The defenders of Mount Seraphina had transformed the granite mountain into an underground maze of interconnected tunnels, bunkers, and fighting positions that defied every military convention of the era. The 3rd Valdorian Women's Infantry Regiment, commanded by Colonel Anastasia Volkov, had been holding these positions for 127 days, repelling every assault with a ferocity that had cost the Allied forces over 8,000 casualties. Each cave mouth had become a deadly funnel that consumed Allied lives by the dozens, turning seasoned combat veterans into statistics. Artillery bombardments that should have pulverized concrete barely scratched the surface of their granite fortress. Naval gunfire that had leveled entire coastal cities left the Valdorian positions untouched, their women defenders emerging from underground chambers like ghosts to pour devastating automatic weapon fire on advancing Allied troops. The mountain had become a killing field where conventional tactics went to die. What the Valdorian defenders didn't know, what their extensive intelligence networks had failed to detect, was that Allied engineers had been perfecting a weapon specifically designed to counter their underground defensive strategy. While conventional forces prepared for another costly frontal assault that would likely claim thousands more lives, a specialized unit of the Allied 7th Experimental Warfare Division had been training with equipment that would transform siege warfare forever. The weapon that would break the deadlock wasn't new in concept. Fire had been humanity's companion in warfare since the dawn of civilization. But the Allied engineers, working in absolute secrecy at the Thornfield Research Facility in northern Scotland, had engineered something far more devastating than anything previously imagined. The XM4 Inferno projector, codenamed Dragon's Breath, could project burning chemical compounds 200 feet through the narrowest openings, its pressurized stream flowing like liquid nightmare through the very tunnel systems the Valdorians believed made them invincible. According to captured Valdorian documents discovered after the war, Colonel Volkov had received intelligence reports about Allied flamethrower units operating in other theaters. But the reports described the primitive portable models used in earlier campaigns, weapons with limited range and fuel capacity, effective only in close-quarters combat against surface positions. No intelligence agency had warned her about the new truck-mounted systems that could pump 750 gallons of thickened napalm through reinforced titanium hoses, turning entire tunnel complexes into furnaces that burned at temperatures exceeding 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. The development of this weapon had begun 8 months earlier, when Allied High Command realized that conventional tactics against the Valdorian mountain fortresses were achieving nothing but massacre. General Patricia Montgomery, commanding the Allied Expeditionary Force, had personally requested the development of something that can reach them where they hide. The scientific team, led by Dr. Margaret Blackwood, a brilliant chemical engineer from Cambridge, had worked 18-hour days to create what would become the most terrifying weapon of the war. Dr. Blackwood's personal journal, discovered in her estate decades later, revealed the moral struggle behind the weapon's development. We are creating something that violates every principle of civilized warfare. But watching our soldiers die by the thousands against these impregnable positions, I fear we have no choice. God forgive us for what we are about to unleash. The first indication that something fundamental had changed came at 0645 hours on March 8, 1943. Allied units of the 12th Infantry Brigade, advancing on Section Delta 7 of the mountain fortress, encountered the familiar pattern of withering fire from concealed positions. Machine gun nests carved into granite faces opened up from multiple angles, their crossfire cutting down entire squads within seconds of their advance beginning. The Allied forces had seen this defensive pattern 97 times before, each assault ending in bloody retreat.
Captain Isabella Rodriguez, commanding Delta Company, watched through her field glasses as her soldiers sought cover behind scattered boulders, pinned down by accurate fire from positions they couldn't even see. The Valdorian women had perfected the art of invisible warfare, firing from deep within cave mouths before vanishing back into the mountain-like wraiths. It was like fighting ghosts, Rodriguez later wrote in her combat memoir. They were everywhere and nowhere, killing us from shadows we couldn't penetrate. But this time, instead of calling for artillery support or requesting another futile airstrike, Captain Rodriguez radioed for the special equipment. 30 minutes later, a convoy of 6 modified trucks approached the forward positions, their unusual cargo covered by heavy tarpaulins. The Valdorian defenders, observing through sophisticated periscope systems hidden throughout the mountainside, noted the unusual vehicles but couldn't identify their purpose from their concealed positions deep within the granite. Sergeant Major Diana Chen, operating one of the new Dragon's Breath units, later described the moment in a letter that wouldn't be declassified until 1987. You could hear them in there, calling to each other in Valdorian, coordinating their defensive fire. Their voices echoed through the tunnels like they were in a cathedral. They had no idea we were about to turn their sanctuary into hell itself. The pressurized napalm mixture, heated to over 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit and enhanced with experimental adhesive compounds, entered the primary cave opening and immediately began its devastating work. The burning gel didn't just flow, it seemed to hunt, following every tunnel branch, every air passage, every carefully constructed ventilation shaft that the Valdorians had spent months carving from solid rock. The chemical compound adhered to granite walls, equipment, and anyone it encountered, creating an inferno that consumed oxygen faster than human lungs could process it. Within 45 seconds, the machine gun fire from Section Delta 7 stopped completely. Within 3 minutes, the entire defensive complex fell silent except for the roar of flames consuming everything within. But the Allied forces quickly discovered something that exceeded their most optimistic projections. The tunnel systems that the Valdorian engineers had spent 4 months constructing had become conduits for the flaming liquid, spreading the fire far beyond the intended target zone. Lieutenant Sarah Williams, leading the 2nd Assault Platoon, watched in amazement as cave openings across a quarter-mile section of the mountain face began glowing with hellish orange light. "We targeted one bunker," she reported to her commanding officer via radio, "and the entire mountainside lit up like the aurora borealis made of fire." The Valdorian defenders had unknowingly engineered their own destruction, creating an interconnected network that turned their greatest defensive advantage into a highway for liquid death. The response from the Valdorian positions revealed the true horror of their situation and the tactical genius of their female leadership even in desperate circumstances. According to radio intercepts captured by Allied communications intelligence units, Valdorian operators began transmitting urgent messages in their native language. Огонь в тоннеле 7 распространяется во все секторы. Не можем сдерживать. Fire in Tunnel 7, spreading to all sectors, cannot contain, followed by increasingly desperate static-filled transmissions. Major Katerina Petrov, commanding the Section Delta Defensive Complex, made a decision that would later be studied in military academies as an example of extraordinary leadership under impossible circumstances. Rather than allow the fire to spread through the main tunnel network to other defensive positions, she ordered her communications team to transmit evacuation routes to isolated units, while simultaneously directing her engineering teams to begin controlled demolitions that would seal burning sections from the rest of the complex. Her final radio transmission, recorded by Allied monitoring stations and later translated, demonstrated the discipline that had made the Valdorian women's infantry so formidable. Tell Colonel Volkov that Section Delta held for 128 days. Tell my daughter that her mother died as a soldier, not as prey. The tunnel complex was found sealed with emergency charges and the bodies of 7 women 3 days later, all positioned at defensive points facing the sealed entrances. The psychological impact of the Dragon's Breath weapon proved as developing as its physical destruction. Valdorian soldiers who had endured months of conventional bombardment without breaking began abandoning forward positions at the first confirmed sighting of the Allied flamethrower trucks. The weapon that had been designed to reach underground positions had evolved into something that could break the will of the most determined defenders simply through its reputation. Allied units reported entire sections of the Valdorian defense line going silent within hours of the first Dragon's Breath deployment. Positions that had required weeks of costly assault to capture in previous campaigns fell within minutes once the flamethrower teams moved into range. The carefully constructed defensive network that had cost Allied forces thousands of casualties was unraveling with terrifying efficiency, one tunnel system at a time. Captain Rodriguez, advancing through positions that had been impregnable just hours before, documented scenes that would remain classified for decades. The granite walls were blackened, but more unsettling was the silence. These tunnels had been full of voices, footsteps, the sounds of women who had turned warfare into an art form. Now there was nothing but the echo of our own movements and the smell of burned chemical compounds that seemed to seep from the rock itself. By the end of the first day of Dragon's Breath operations, Allied intelligence estimated that 45% of the northern mountain defensive positions had been neutralized by flamethrower attacks. The Valdorian command structure, which depended on underground communication lines running through the tunnel networks, began fragmenting as passage routes became impassable furnaces. Orders couldn't reach isolated units trapped in undamaged sections. Ammunition resupply became impossible through burning passages that remained lethal for days. The integrated defense that had made Mount Seraphina impregnable was literally consuming itself from within.
But the Allied forces soon realized they had unleashed something beyond their complete control. The granite composition of Mount Seraphina, which had made it so defensible against conventional weapons, also trapped heat in ways the engineers hadn't fully anticipated. Cleared tunnel systems continued burning for days, the rock itself becoming a heat sink that maintained lethal temperatures long after the initial chemical fires had consumed their fuel. Recovery teams couldn't enter neutralized positions to search for intelligence documents or confirm casualty counts. Technical Sergeant Rebecca Hayes, tasked with documenting the weapon's effectiveness for future tactical development, described scenes that would influence post-war chemical weapons treaties. The tunnels just kept burning, like we'd ignited the mountain itself. We'd think a section was completely cleared, then see smoke rising from granite fissures hundreds of yards away. It was like we'd awakened something inside the rock that couldn't be put back to sleep. The Valdorian defenders faced an impossible tactical situation. Remaining underground meant facing the spreading chemical fires that followed routes they themselves had carved. Emerging to fight on the surface meant exposing themselves to Allied rifles, machine guns, and artillery in terrain that offered no natural cover. Many units chose a third option that spoke to both their desperation and their unwavering discipline. According to Allied Medical Corps reports, the number of Valdorian soldiers found dead from self-inflicted wounds increased dramatically as Dragon's Breath attacks intensified across the mountain fortress.
Colonel Volkov, monitoring the situation from her command bunker deep within the mountain's core, realized that her carefully planned defensive strategy had been turned into a weapon against her own forces. Months of engineering work, thousands of tons of excavated granite, sophisticated ventilation systems designed to keep her soldiers alive during extended sieges, all of it had become a delivery system for Allied chemical weapons. In a desperate attempt to salvage the situation, Volkov attempted to reorganize her remaining forces into surface defensive positions using the limited natural cover available on Mount Seraphina's exposed slopes. But months of tactical planning had been based entirely on underground protection and concealment. Her soldiers, elite as they were, had no prepared positions above ground, no camouflage suited for granite terrain, no overhead cover against Allied air power. They were exposed and vulnerable in ways they hadn't experienced since their initial deployment to the mountain fortress. The Allied Dragon's Breath crews, initially shocked by their weapons' devastating effectiveness against positions they had considered nearly impregnable, began developing tactical innovations that multiplied the system's impact exponentially. Teams learned to coordinate simultaneous attacks on multiple tunnel entrances, creating chemical firestorms that spread through entire defensive complexes faster than human beings could flee. The weapon designed for precision attacks against individual bunkers had evolved into something approaching a strategic capability that could neutralize entire mountain defensive systems. Allied field commanders reviewing the day's unprecedented success in their evening briefings realized they had stumbled upon something that would fundamentally change siege warfare doctrine. The casualty reports told a story that seemed almost impossible to believe. Allied losses had dropped to their lowest levels since the campaign began, while Valdorian assistance was collapsing across sectors that had seemed impregnable just 24 hours earlier. Dr. Blackwood, monitoring the weapon's performance from the Thornfield Research Facility, recorded her observations with growing unease. The Dragon's Breath has exceeded every projection we made during development, but watching the tactical reports, I fear we've created something that goes beyond military necessity into the realm of systematic extermination. The weapon is too effective, too indiscriminate once deployed underground. We may have solved the tactical problem, but at what moral cost? But as night fell on March 8, 1943, the true scope of what had been unleashed was only beginning to become apparent to both sides. The chemical fires burning deep within Mount Seraphina's granite heart showed no signs of diminishing. Smoke continued rising from dozens of locations across the mountain face, creating an otherworldly landscape that seemed torn from humanity's darkest nightmares. And the Allied forces were learning that some weapons, once released into confined spaces, could not be easily controlled, contained, or even fully understood. The battle for Mount Seraphina was about to take a turn that would shock military observers on both sides and demonstrate that even the most expertly prepared defensive positions could be transformed into death traps by weapons their builders had never imagined possible. The mountain fortress that was supposed to hold out indefinitely against any conventional assault was about to surrender its secrets to liquid fire, one tunnel system at a time, taking with it some of the most skilled female soldiers in military history.
March 15, 1943. 1 week after the first Dragon's Breath deployment, Mount Seraphina had become a smoldering monument to the terrible efficiency of chemical warfare. What began as a tactical breakthrough had evolved into something approaching systematic annihilation. The mountain that had defied Allied forces for over 4 months was now a granite crematorium, its tunnels transformed into channels of death that claimed lives long after the fighting had officially ended. Commander Elena Vasquez stood on the deck of the UNS Artemisia, watching smoke continue to rise from dozens of points across the mountain face. Her logbook entry for March 15th would later be cited in war crimes tribunals. The fires show no signs of abating. We estimate 3,200 Valdorian women soldiers remain trapped in sealed sections of the tunnel complex. They face a choice between suffocation, burning, or surrender to forces they've fought for 135 days. Many are choosing death. The cascading effects of the Dragon's Breath weapon had exceeded every projection made by Allied tactical planners. What Dr. Margaret Blackwood's team had designed as a precision instrument for neutralizing specific defensive positions had become something far more devastating. The interconnected tunnel network that Colonel Anastasia Volkov's engineers had carved from solid granite over 4 months had become a distribution system for liquid death, carrying chemical fire to sections of the mountain fortress that Allied forces hadn't even known existed. Captain Isabella Rodriguez, leading the first recovery teams into cleared sections of the complex, documented discoveries that would haunt military historians for decades. We found entire barracks sections where women had been overcome by chemical fumes while sleeping, she reported to Allied High Command. Personal effects scattered on bunks, letters half-written to families back in Valdoria, photographs of children and husbands pinned to granite walls. These weren't just soldiers. They were mothers, daughters, sisters who had been turned into statistics by our invisible weapon. The human cost became staggering as recovery operations continued. Unlike conventional combat deaths, which could be counted and documented, the Dragon's Breath casualties defied accurate assessment. Many bodies were never recovered, consumed entirely by chemical fires that burned at temperatures exceeding those of industrial furnaces. Allied Medical Corps estimated that over 4,000 Valdorian women had died in the tunnel complexes, but the true number would never be known. Major Katerina Petrov's final defensive action saved hundreds of lives in the deeper sections of the complex, but it had also created a humanitarian nightmare. The controlled demolitions that sealed burning tunnel sections trapped nearly 800 women soldiers in areas with limited food, water, and air supplies. Radio communications indicated that many were still alive, but reaching them required tunneling through sections where chemical fires continued burning weeks after the initial attack. Sergeant Major Diana Chen, whose Dragon's Breath unit had initiated the first attack, found herself assigned to rescue operations that forced her to confront the consequences of her weapon's efficiency. "We could hear them calling for help through cracks in the granite," she wrote in her personal journal. Women who had been our enemies for months, now trapped by fires we had started. Some refused rescue, preferring to die as soldiers rather than become prisoners. Others begged us to save their wounded comrades before themselves. The psychological impact on Allied forces proved almost as devastating as the weapon's effect on the Valdorians. Soldiers who had celebrated the breakthrough began experiencing what military psychiatrists would later classify as moral injury. The efficiency that had made Dragon's Breath tactically successful created an emotional burden that conventional combat hadn't prepared them for. Dr. Blackwood arrived at Mount Seraphina on March 20th to study her weapon's performance in field conditions. What she found shattered her scientific objectivity. "I created this weapon to save Allied lives," she confided to her research assistant. "The mathematics were simple. Break their defensive capability quickly to end the siege. But walking through these tunnels, seeing what chemical fire does to human beings in confined spaces, I understand that some mathematical solutions create moral problems that can never be solved." The international implications began emerging as news of the Dragon's Breath weapon spread beyond the immediate theater of operations. Valdorian radio broadcasts, transmitted from their capital city of Drakmor, accused Allied forces of using weapons that violated international war conventions. The League of Nations demanded immediate access to Mount Seraphina to investigate reports of chemical weapons deployment against defensive positions. General Patricia Montgomery faced growing pressure from Allied political leadership to minimize the weapon's chemical aspects in official reports. "Frame it as an advanced incendiary system," she was instructed by the War Department. "Emphasize tactical necessity, not chemical composition." But the evidence was impossible to conceal. The distinctive green-tinged smoke rising from Mount Seraphina could be seen from ships 30 miles away.
The final surrender came not through military defeat, but through a negotiated evacuation that took 3 weeks to complete. Colonel Volkov, speaking through intermediaries, agreed to surrender her remaining forces in exchange for Allied assistance in rescuing women trapped in sealed tunnel sections. "We will not let our soldiers die like rats in holes," her message stated. "If you want this mountain, help us save those who can still be saved."
The rescue operations revealed the true scope of Valdorian defensive preparations. Allied engineers discovered tunnel networks extending over 15 miles through the mountain's interior, connecting positions that surface reconnaissance had never detected. Workshops where women had manufactured ammunition from scavenged materials. Underground hospitals where Valdorian medics had treated wounded soldiers for months without adequate supplies. Libraries where off-duty soldiers had continued their education during the siege. Captain Rodriguez's final report to Allied Command contained observations that would influence post-war military doctrine. "We didn't defeat an army, we destroyed a community. These women had created an entire society inside this mountain. They had schools, theaters, even a chapel carved from granite. Our weapon didn't just kill soldiers, it destroyed a culture that had adapted to survive indefinitely underground." The casualty statistics, compiled weeks after the fighting ended, revealed the Dragon's Breath weapon's unprecedented efficiency. In 7 days of chemical attacks, Allied forces had achieved what 4 months of conventional assault had failed to accomplish. But the cost in Valdorian lives was staggering. 4,247 confirmed deaths, 312 missing and presumed dead, 89 survivors rescued from sealed sections, and 156 who surrendered during the final evacuation. Dr. Blackwood's final assessment of her weapon became a classified document that wouldn't be released until 1978. The Dragon's Breath proved that underground defensive positions, regardless of their sophistication, cannot withstand chemical weapons designed specifically for confined spaces. From a purely tactical perspective, the weapon achieved total success. From a humanitarian perspective, it represents a crossing of lines that conventional warfare had managed to avoid in generations. The international ramifications extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. The Dragon's Breath deployment at Mount Seraphina became a catalyst for post-war chemical weapons treaties that would prohibit the development of similar systems. Dr. Blackwood testified before international tribunals, her scientific testimony helping to establish protocols that would govern warfare for decades. The survivors faced their own long-term consequences. Many of the 245 Valdorian women who surrendered or were rescued suffered permanent respiratory damage from chemical exposure. Allied medical records indicated that over 60% developed chronic breathing problems, while others experienced psychological trauma that military medicine wasn't equipped to treat. The mountain itself bore permanent scars. Granite walls in the tunnel systems showed chemical etching that remained visible decades later. Sections of the complex continued producing toxic fumes for months, requiring specialized ventilation equipment to make them safe for investigation. The fortress that had been engineered to last indefinitely had been rendered permanently uninhabitable by 7 days of chemical warfare. In the end, Mount Seraphina stood as a monument to the terrible efficiency of weapons designed to turn defensive advantages into fatal vulnerabilities. The Dragon's Breath had proven that no position, however well prepared or bravely defended, could withstand chemical weapons specifically engineered for underground warfare. The 4,000 women who died in those granite tunnels had become casualties, not just of war, but of humanity's endless capacity to devise new methods of systematic killing.